This is very much in my heart and in my mind, and I wish I could go around the country speaking to you, speaking to other people, as I speak to you this afternoon. What I hope to do is to give you some greater insight into what's going on in our health service, or what has gone on with it. And it reflects a lot of your concerns, in fact, as UKIP. That's the fact of it. It's a rather sickly story, really. That's the title of the talk, and I added last night or the night before, and what has gone on before, and that is very important indeed. And you notice the Privy Council a bit. Next slide, Marilyn. Now, what I put this slide up for is to emphasize the fact that a lot of health matters are communal. They're not people taking 10 quid in their back pocket to the local bupa man to sort out. And this is one good example. I'm sure that these go back in history a long way, no doubt back to times of the Greeks and perhaps the Babylonians. But 1854, a big cholera epidemic as people flooded in to London, and Dr. John Snow, who obviously had a brain and a microscope, he didn't believe in the miasma theory of infection. He examined the stool fluid under the microscope. He didn't actually see the vibrio, the cholera vibrio, but he gathered it was a bacterium of sorts. And the local council, with him, decided to remove the pump handle. Now, the epidemic was already, in fact, reached its peak and was over the peak, so it may not have been crucial, but 600 people died in the Soho area, and it was an excellent demonstration of people using their nous, their intelligence, and then taking concerted action, which is to remove the source of the infected water from the well beneath the pump. Concerted action for public good. I tried to encapsulate it in that way. I have done so. Next slide. Now, this is the father of orthopedic surgery I'm talking about now, and he really was a remarkable man, a wonderful man, really. And I think he's a sort of fellow we should be remembering now in this era of the third rate, and where there is very little lack of leadership. The Manchester ship, good. Anyway, you'll see 1988, 20,000 workers, and you can see them down there with little, they got steam shovels and barrows and things like that. Next one. The first comprehensive accident service, and I suspect it was in the world. The canal was divided into 3 sections, and there was a hospital for each section. And he had medical personnel trained in fracture management. It wasn't some ad hoc nonsense. Hospitals linked by a railway, and they would phone him up on the telegraph and get him along if they had a severely injured worker to deal with. And you'll see in the bottom that he personally managed 3,000 cases. And in this systematic way, because he'd organized it and he used his brain, he in fact finished this exercise knowing much more about fracture treatment. So the general knowledge in our specialty was enlarged by his thoughtfulness in what he did there. He set up, you may know the hospital, the Sir Robert Jones and Agnes Hunt. She was a nurse. Hospital in Shropshire, Oswestry. Next one. Now, a different sort of personality and human being who I think was less constructive. You see that at university she was influenced by Friedrich von Hayek. Interestingly, actually, his son was a bacteriologist at Torbay Hospital with me. And then she was influenced later on by Milton Friedman. Who knows Milton Friedman? He was about 5 or 6. He has had a crucial influence on the Western world. Remember Alan Walters, a rather dried up man, he used to come on television quite a bit. Never heard of him, don't see him now. And he was the chief economic advisor. Next slide. Now, the dogma was the internal market. That was one aspect of it. There's more to it than that. But it arose from this free market idea. And in 1989 they published a paper, a white paper probably, called Working for Patients. Well, I'd question that. There's some irony in that. I became aware of it and I stood up against it almost. It was a fairly lonely exercise. And I was quite quickly aware that there were some doctors who were in the 5th column who were pushing this along very nicely at Torbay. That is not paranoia, that happened. And I can see that. But now I'll just tell you the story quickly. The manager for the Southwest Regional Board, who was a nurse actually, or had been a nurse, an unpleasant individual, she came down to speak. She had all the Department of Health slides, all in blue, to promote this idea. And I'd studied it, and we had a very good little debate at Torbay Hospital. A fellow from the BMA and a fellow from the King's Fund came down, and I questioned her. This is what goes on. She gave her talk, and I stood up. Miss Hawkins, remember her name now? I said, Miss Hawkins, the present cost of administration in the NHS budget is about 5%, is it not? Yes. I said, is it not likely that this plan will increase the cost of administration by, say, up to 8 or 9%? Swept aside. 7%, she said. And I then asked another question, and the medical chairman, the gynecologist now dead, said, sit down. So there were about 60 or 70 consultants there. And I, as a middle-aged, very active consultant in orthopedics and trauma, was asked to sit down. This is the intellectual, this is the moral atmosphere that in fact obtains in our country too often. You're not allowed to say your piece. Of all the people, I knew most about it because I'd bothered to read it up and go to the meetings about it. Doesn't that sadden you? It was very shocking actually for me. I felt, it still lasts in me, the feeling of being told to sit down. So Thatcher was determined to roll back the state. That was the slogan. And the Centre for Policy Studies she'd set up with Sir Keith Joseph had such blind policies in its guts. The untried, untested internal market was introduced. Next slide. This is sort of going back a little bit. It was based on the Kaiser Permanente plan. That's a steel-making magnet, Kaiser Permanente. And it's still running actually, but it's a very selected audience. There are people who are fairly well off, who pay in rather like Bupa, and they have their own medical centres. They do not deal with the indigent, the poor people. And you will see, in fact, if you go on reading that down, that's why I thought it. I thought it was the thin end of the wedge for the destruction of the NHS. And this was a killing. There was another thing too, it's not on the slide. What it depended on, this competition, if you had 2 hospitals, Bournemouth, is there Boscombe, there are 2 hospitals there, aren't there? Only one now, is it? All pools there, all right? But the commissioning body, which is just being set up on the 1st of April, they in fact will ask, say, for hip replacements from there and from Poole, and say Bournemouth get them all, the big contract. Poole goes to the wall in about a year or two, and this is happening in America under this scheme. So hospitals are becoming shells. I'm not sure how many, in fact, did that way, but it relied on that. It relied on failure. And but what was also telling, that this man from the King's Fund told me, Mr. Best, was they had not established the cost of administering it. So here's this magic from America, and they do not know what it's going to cost to run it. How about that? Next slide. And they didn't know, our lot didn't know either. So there's a very powerful think tank. As you know, there are about 3,000 or 4,000 think tanks in America. Think, not much thinking. A lot of it's dogma, you know, being driven by some sort of almost visceral urge, in fact, quite often. And as we shall see later on, as I say, if you want to ruin the NHS, ask the Yanks. It's about the worst health system in the world. Now, the cost of admin was 5 or 6%. Not always easy to find these things, but that's what they reckoned. And it added in that first year, no one knows this, you ask the population of Britain, what did Thatcher's internal market do for our NHS? No one will know that it in fact doubled the cost of administration. But I knew it would, but I was told to sit down. And I was just one tiny voice. But think of the waste in that. As I say, you could have done 1/3 hip replacements with that money if that's what you wanted to do. So posts, paper and computer screens proliferated. And I can see now in the annex where they used to look after fever patients in Torbay, I could see a whole corridor full of computer monitors, redundant after some years, because they introduced this system called PAS, where the nurses had to put in whether people had a bowel motion or a cotton wool swab. All absolute nonsense. Next slide. So, we have the motivation, that's roll back the state, private, is it? Believing in capital only, and of course there's mixtures, and mixtures are sensible usually. Monetarism, globalization, that's a very big factor, and roll back the state. Self-reliance, that was emphasized, and I'm all for that. The profit motive driving individual energy and ingenuity, that was also promoted, and I don't think we can dispute that, wouldn't want to. Private good, public bad. And the dogma again, so we had the gas, telephones, electricity, and eventually the railways. And you know how successful that has been when you have monopolies running the whole show, and then you split up the wheels from the track, you know, which was in fact, they had to do that, the Tory government, the Major's government, because of some competition thing with the EU, I should remember. But where we have that arrangement with us, the cohesion, so you've got legions of people claiming money back from Network Rail because the trainers have been stopped by snow or whatever. People arguing to ad nauseum about these things. So what I want to think about now, you remember Macmillan in fact stood against it and talked about selling the family silver. Look, we must think of the intentions. So when these people set about things, you have to say, what are they doing? What is their intention? Is it a good intention? Do they want to run the service better? Or do they want to run it down or make it so complicated it can't run at all? Next slide. Well, there's a nice chap. This fellow, I think of all human beings, I loathe in my guts, and I've done quite a lot. I actually sent him some of my articles. This was in Canada with Stronach, who has quite close connections with Tel Aviv. And there he was. It's the most high definition picture you'll see of this creature. He should be in a cold jail on a cold island in Terra del Fuego. Next one. they had exactly the same policies. They are, and I'm sure UKIP might like to agree with this, they are like peas in a pod, really. Hope I haven't worried that lady too much. That was one of the little tricks, choice. You said all sorts of little things, you see, choice. That sounds good. You say, oh, you can choose your GP, choose your surgeon, choose this, choose that. In fact, I think choice was, there was a bit of extra choice, and I'll come to that. We had these STCs built by the state. There was one in Plymouth, about 30 miles down the road from us. I had to deal with 2 of the complications from there. Their infection rate in the first year from hips was 4%. And an infected hip, 0.1% is a disaster, I can tell you. It's a terrible thing to have around your neck as a patient. But that's what the infection rate was, and they had a surgeon from Sweden, one from Germany. There was no team, there was no esprit de corps, they were sort of mechanics, you know, brought in fact, much less than mechanics, really. Thinking of Alan now. So, spending was much increased. In fact, it shot up. Waiting lists were slashed, no question about that. It was often against assigned clinical priority. If you had 2,000 bunions, although it's often an unnecessary operation, I can tell you that, the bunions would be done because the waiting list was longer for them. Now this is very interesting, actually, this. If you could study this, a younger colleague who I was on the appointment board for, who joined us at Torbay, they were seeing that 5 patients were listed by a Greek, actually, but he didn't have a high qualification, and I knew this, he listed people for arthroscopy, that's a telescope bit in the knee, quite often. So there's a long list built up, so we must have a waiting list initiative. So this consultant who we appointed did 5 cases that Saturday morning. Each of the 5 knees was normal, whereas if you are, you know, a fully qualified surgeon and conscientious and seen a lot, you know from the story what knee you need to look inside or not. And a lot of them, in fact, say go off and ride a bike for a bit and see how it gets on, and many get better. But 5 were done and they were normal knees. Cost of that for the staff, he got £300 per patient. And the fact is that sometimes people have ill effects from arthroscopy. And that president of the CBI, I forget his name now, married to that not very lady something, raised in the Marsh Arabs. He died of a pulmonary embolus following arthroscopy. Can happen. So you don't operate on people without good reason. But that's what it was all about, you see, figures, to push them through and to make it look good for New Labour and for Mr. Blair. Yes, PFI, they pushed that as well. That was jam, not tomorrow, but jam today. Jam today. So they built courthouses, schools, and lots of hospitals, and now, I think somewhere I put it down, lead boots. The PFI is lead boots. The Lewisham Hospital you've heard about, they're having to sell off the A&E department or close it because of PFI down the road. The beds in Devon that I've been fighting for with others, at Ashburton and Bovey Hospital, they want those beds to be put into the PFI hospital in Newton Abbot, which is costing 2.4 million per year annual charge. That's a mortgage. It's costing about 3 times more than if they'd have used the money from the Treasury to build the hospital. Next one. Now, this is a powerhouse in this system. It's not surgeons or doctors or people like myself who spent 11 years training from the time we left medical school to the time I became a consultant. These are people who work for McKinsey's and PricewaterhouseCoopers, and they're in it like Death Watch Beetle. They're all over the shop. And this chap in the middle, Bennett, I think this is, I'm not sure whether he's still there, I don't know. This talk was given in February last year to the Exeter University Students' Labour Club. Very good lot of young people, actually. It was Bradshaw was previous Minister of Health, being very smooth towards me. But these are the people, and you see the thing, see what goes on. This chap is invited to New York and gets 6,000 quid worth of 5-star hotel treatment or heavier time. And this is part of our health service. But these people run the show. Monitor will be telling the commissioning groups that they're setting up, which will become fully active on the 1st of April, they will be telling them what to do and whether to go to private providers or what have you. But we'll get on to that. Next one. Next one. Now this is a bit of personal bit in this as well. This is an example of the caliber and the principle which we find in the House of Commons. You know all about the expenses thing, actually. Well, this is a bit of it, actually, really. But this is Mark Simmons, very smooth, and you see that he declared in his registered members' interests 12,500 quid for advising Circle Health. It's a growing private health company. They're running Huntington Hospital now, and they have some private hospitals as well. Big funding from venture capitalists behind them. And that's what he declared. Anyway, I looked into this. My sister helps me in all this. She's wonderful, in fact, in researching things. So, as I said, he did not declare the bribe, it is a bribe, of £1,250 per hour when he was discussing the health bill in the House of Commons. So I wrote to John Lyon, the parliamentary commissioner. Although he seemed a rather toothless chap, although you can't find it very easily, and I didn't know it from correspondence to me from John Lyon, there's in fact a large thing on the internet where it was followed along, and Lyon really had to tie him down, and he in fact eventually had to apologize. 6 words in the House, 6 words. But I pointed out to John Lyon, what does a care worker think when she sees him getting 1,250 per hour? Isn't it nauseous? He knows nothing about health anyway. What he's doing, you see, he's on inside track. He knows what they're thinking and what they're saying in the tea room in the House of Commons and in the clubs. That's what he's saying. That's why he's there for Circle Health. Next one. The World Bank, IMF, GATS, that sounds a bit familiar, isn't it, really? European thing, isn't it, GATS? To which was added, or you can add the EU, do you know the Bolkestein Directive? That's if you, supposing like the Latvian person who's served us lunch today, if the Latvian comes back over here, if she's come over here, she can be paid here the wage it should be paid in Latvia. That's the Bolkestein Directive. So it's a very good way of driving down the wages throughout the European Union. It's a race to the bottom. We'll need to care for more and more people. The aged, the epidemic of dementia, they talk about 2 million by 2030. There's a cause for that, must be a cause for that, and obesity. Will the cherry pickers, will Circle Health be looking after the dementia people? Not on your Nelly. Not on your Nelly. So that's something to consider. And yes, is it benevolent, or does it arise, this is what is the motivation, or does it arise from the monetarist belief that the dominant force in human society is profit? Well, although I had a successful private practice and did well in that, my job was in the health service. That's my first job. And I know very well that the best things in society arise from concern for others. Next slide. We'll leave that. That hasn't been adapted, that slide. There's a typographical error there. There was no electoral mandate for this massive upheaval which we're going through now, none at all. They didn't say in, when was the last election? 2010, wasn't it? Or 11? 10, wasn't it?
10.
May 10, wasn't it? There was nothing said about any health bill. But you can guarantee that the elements of it were all in place, and the Death Watch Beatles have been busy for years setting it up. The strategy is to confuse with myriad detail, to divide and to demoralize. And I think the health service staff are probably, if I know, they are demoralized now, to generalize. Not everybody, but a lot of people are fearful of their jobs, and they are not particularly proud of their service when they need to be, and they are usually. And the other thing is that they've constructed a fait accompli to achieve feelings of resignation. Very important in public manipulation, actually, is that. Next one. I'll just pick out, I can't see, from standing here I can't read the screen very easily, but it is an elemental struggle between rabid capital and common good, where the fit care for the sick. The Chicago School acolytes would rejoice in seeing this socialist success story dismantled as Lansley has planned. They want that. This is the last good example, I know it's not perfect, of a socialist, or of the common good. Leave the socialist bit out of it. But they would want to see it. They would put the flags up. They'd relish it. They want that because they want to show that it's all failed. And then, just one little thing. US construction worker on Panorama in a tent village where the homeless are being housed. He had a hernia. Alan was speaking earlier on. Where's Alan? You were. He was speaking earlier on about the food banks growing in this country. He had a hernia and was encouraged to visit a local hospital with a view to its repair. £20,000 was the answer. $20,000. Almost pounds now, isn't it? No work, no money, were his words. And know that 50 million people, the poorest of the USA, cannot afford insurance. Between 15, and mind you, some people say, well, so what? That's some people say that. Between 15 and 20% of GDP is spent in the USA on medical services, bureaucracy, and the insurance industry, which in fact is up to massive fiddles with the state, and the federal state. And the insured are over-medicalized, of course. That is what is planned here. Next one. You see the quote from Mr. Blair. See that one? I thought it was a very good one. There are hundreds of quotes of Blair on the internet, but I thought he was very convincing on that first one. And this is interesting, you see, with Mr. Cameron. He died, I forget his name actually now, but Ian, who died, you know, who had cerebral palsy. And, but the last words are the ones that I'm pointing to. He said, well, Blair said education, education, education. I can do it in 3 letters, NHS. Convincing, isn't it? Next one. Now here's a chap from the west of here, Somerset, Mr. Letwin. Now this is not a formal quotation. This is group, 6 contractors who met him, and he encouraged them to get involved in the PFI in Dorchester. It doesn't quite ring, because the only place I know in Dorchester is the hospital of that sort, which has been built for longer than that. But you will see that, in fact, he said within 5 years of a Conservative election victory, the NHS will not exist anymore. So his intentions were plain. If the quotation is correct, I have to say that. I wasn't there. This is hearsay, really. Next one. And then this discussion on Radio 4, I'd skip some of the thing actually, but it's the people who, it's the Death Watch Beatles again. It's Matthew Taylor, who was in Blair's policy unit in the in Downing Street. They're all there, you see. Who's in charge doesn't matter very much. The Beatles are still there working away. Eamon Butler and this fellow Tim Evans. A bit more about him later. And at the end of the interview, Butler replied, "It's been 20 years in the planning, do you see? I think they'll do it." In other words, take the health service down. So he's indicating that it's not like that, it's just happened. They've been at it for a long time. Next one. Onion rings, and you'll see in fact that he was Director General of the Centre for the New Europe. Try googling that. Also see in fact that he was the Executive Director for Public Affairs of this Independent Healthcare Association. So here is a chap who's been central in health service strategy, who's been very much involved with the private providers for a long time. And down the bottom, he's there at Bramshill talking to the police about economics and politics of the future. What's he talking to the coppers about this for? You begin to wonder, don't you? Next one. That's true, but Hitler knew that people were used to little lies and they tolerated little lies, but they'd never believe a big lie was a lie. Do you see? And that's one thing. Muggeridge, I hadn't seen that quotation before, but it's true. People, if they have an inbuilt prejudice, they feed that rather than thinking afresh. And then that's highly relevant, because this change in our health service, which is taking place now, I couldn't be speaking at a more appropriate time, because it is going up like this is a Richter scale 10 change in the health service happening now. So you've invited me at a good time, really, except I find it a rather difficult time. But this is a law that's being passed, a bill. And when you think, why does it need to be a bill? Why is it a bill? I know why it's a bill, because they can in fact kick us all and make sure we do it. Do you see what I mean? Next one. Yes, reform. I object to the word reform. It's always used in the wrong context. And modernisation too. I wrote an article for the Western Morning News. There's an assistant editor there who I've met before actually, and he's rather nice. May I write an article? He says, yes, feel free. I've done it before. And at the end, towards the end, I put this: to heal is a calling, and caring for the sick is a sacred human privilege and duty. And I feel that race. I'm not religious at all, but as having looked after a lot of people in my time, I feel that very strongly indeed, actually. And all this is diminished by the way these people speak about our health service and the way the Death Watch beetles get busy. Do you see? They've got economic theory and stuff that's inside them. We have to run it, obviously, efficiently, and with cost very much in our concerns, as we did when I was a young doctor, a young surgeon. This is the essence. Stop the political football. And I've said it for 20 years, and one or two people agree with me, but I knew if I went out publicly and nationally, I wouldn't get anywhere. The thing is, we should have the national executive, well-chosen, decent people, not place people, and they should say, right, Bournemouth, that's 70 million quid, get on with it, and you do your best, all right? But instead, in fact, it's the Minister of Health, you see, and political ideology being pushed all the time, actually. And what we should do as a health service is report to the Health Committee of the Commons via the National Executive, and we say what we've done, what you could do better, what money we might, what more money would help in, or whatever. But that's what it should not be, a political football, which it is at the moment. Next one, very much so. That was the final words of my piece in the Western Morning News. When we lift up the sick and weary, everyone is lifted up. And that is true. If you hear people saying how Auntie had to go in for her fractured hip or whatever, and they say they were marvellous, you know, they really were, you know, they gave us a cup of tea and went in and they told her how sick she was. And you can see everyone they are lifted up. At the moment, you're hearing on the radio and on television every day by the BBC, and it's concerted, it's orchestrated, it's constructive. You're hearing how badly we're doing. Well, okay, we're not doing very well in some hospitals, but you'll hear about the chap that was so dehydrated he took the water from the vase. Well, I thought flower vases were in fact verboten on hospital wards because of just think of the bug actually, Pseudomonas parasinia. Anyway, but you see what happens. That piece of propaganda, just like old Adolf would like, did it happen? I don't know. I'm not going to question that, but you have to think about these things. 1,200 people died at Stafford. Was it 1,200 people died as a direct result of neglect? Obviously, there was terrible things going on there, but a lot of it was they were having weights put on their backs, the people who were on the coalface, and they had these damnable people like Sir what's-name Nicholson, they're trying to get rid of now, who's head honcho over the health service, who in fact heard nothing wrong going on there. Do you see? But you're hearing that from the BBC because the BBC know that the bill has to go, well, it's gone through. They want to see it instituted, and they want to see our health service, by competition with private companies, destroyed. And the BBC is part of that. Next one. Have you heard about this film? Well, Ken Loach, who's in the F Wing, okay, well, I don't care what he is actually, but I think he's a decent man. But he's made a film which is apparently very good. I haven't seen it yet, but it's on tomorrow at our picture house in Exeter. So we're going to go on the way home, I hope. But there's one the nearest one to you, I'm afraid, is Southampton. But what he's done, he's got lots of stills and films, put them together, and that's how it's encapsulated in the publicity material. Generosity, mutual support, and cooperation were the watchwords of the age of 45, when people had enough of war, they'd fought like hell, women had done all sorts of things to sacrifice things to keep things ticking, and they wanted some relief and to look after things properly. It is time to remember the determination of those who were intent on building a better world. Next one. Be outraged. I've come to help inform you. Some of this stuff will have been new to, I hope, about what's been going on in the background. The £3 billion, yes, Mr. Cameron said it will cost £3 billion to institute this reform. How does he know? Not an idea. Thatcher had no idea. It added 5 or 6% at least the internal market thing. What is happening on the 1st of April, very appropriate day, mind you, is catastrophic in my view, and they're still deciding now. I'll be writing in the House of Lords, other people have as well, we've been told to do these things, because they're still using words, Lord Howe particularly, to make it sound as if they won't allow private competition. But they will. And in fact they're doing it on 3 things already. Hearing aids for one, or adult hearing they call it. So what will happen is that, and I've been writing to the chairman, the GP of our local one in Torbay in South Devon, but he's hoping that they'll maintain NHS services and there'll be no privateers or private firms involved. Well, he's hoping. There's no more than that. And in fact, you have to see it, the drive is to get competition going and to pull the system down. Not immediately, it will take some time. What I'm hoping, I've said is, will cost, it is the exocet. That's what it is. It is the Richter 10. It may fail in chaos. People are predicting that. Have you heard that the GPs, they've analysed the BMJ, and 1/3 of all the GPs on these commissioning bodies have got private health service interests. Did you hear that? Did you hear it? No? So it's about 1/3. And I knew that. I knew it from my local one in South Devon, because I found that they had their own company. And I raised that about 2 months ago with our group, finding these beds. But if that is the case, they'll be in trouble. And in fact, there's quite a lot of law which will in fact pull them up, because they talk of imprisonment because they're companies now, these setups, these CCGs, some of them are, and if they don't toe the line, they may find in fact that there's a chap in a blue uniform on the door. Area. Next one. End.